everyone. I really want to welcome you to a very special treat today, a very special guest, Ben Price. I became aware of the work of CELDF, Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, 3.5 years ago, when CELDF came to Asheville to help a community here, Community Roots, to launch a Community Bill of Rights initiative in this area. And what it was going to be addressing for the Asheville area was what we call a energy monopoly, that there's not, that the entire state of North Carolina only has one energy provider, and they've locked our whole area into fossil fuel fracked gas energy provision. So Ben was very kind and did this democracy school that we'll go into later, but without further ado, I want to introduce Ben to everyone. And he has nearly 2 decades of experience with organizing communities across the country, challenging state and federal legalization of corporate assaults against people, communities, and their environment. And one of the ones he worked with was in the City Council of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to recognize the legal rights for ecosystems in 2006. And they also adopted a Community Bill of Rights to ban fracking. And just to show how brazen these corporate raiders are, there was proposals to do fracking operations within the city limits of Pittsburgh. So he's done much work challenging state preemptions of local control over these gas and oil corporations. He also participated in founding the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, and this was in Ecuador in 2010. And he is the author of the book, How Wealth Rules the World, Saving Our Communities and Freedoms from the Dictatorship of Property. So with no further ado, I thought I would cue up our conversation today with just giving the question of talking about the work of CELDF over the years and how this has progressed, and it's much broader than individual battles or fights in individual communities. There's a worldview, a paradigm shifting view to this work. So Ben, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Laurie, and hi, everybody. I'm really honored to be here. Thanks for the opportunity to talk with you. An hour's time is kind of a short time to actually talk about all the things that we've been up to over the past, well, I've been involved with this work for over 17 years now. And Laurie mentioned a couple of the communities that I've worked with, Asheville, North Carolina, of course, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The Pittsburgh ordinance actually was 2010, where they adopted an ordinance that I was invited to draft for city council. And this isn't the kind of work where we just work with the elected, powerful people. It's people in the community who actually make these things happen. And it's about enacting local laws that recognize certain rights, like the right of the people to a healthy environment. In Asheville, North Carolina, it's a right to be free from toxic trespass. Another way of putting that is a right not to be poisoned by industrial activities. And so it seems maybe counterintuitive that we don't already have laws that prevent people and their environments from being poisoned. But of course, our system of so-called environmental protection isn't really about preventing those harms. It's about, some would say, minimizing it or regulating the degree to which the poisoning happens. And so when heavy industry decides they want to site a project in your backyard, in your community, often enough they apply for permits before they can begin their operations. And once they begin, the harms, the damages that are done to the air, water, and soil, and to the health of the people in the community is it's actually legalized by the permits they're issued. There are limits placed on how much damage can be done, but damage itself is legalized. There's a certain amount, for instance, 10,000 parts per million of a certain toxin, are they're legal to be put into the drinking water or the air or the soil. The permits are issued to actually cover and legalize that. And in fact, those permits, they insulate the permit holder, the corporation, from liability to the community. And so when we think about the environmental movement that supposedly we had begun, say, in the 1970s, it really hasn't been an effective movement in terms of actually preventing the harms. Because when we look around, the earth is being destroyed by industrial activities, and we're not effectively preventing that. Our so-called regulations regulate the rate at which we cause the destruction of the environment and the health of people and human communities. It doesn't stop it. It simply regulates the rate, the speed at which we arrive at final, this total destruction of the environment, frankly. And so our approach is to say that not only do the people, their communities, have a right to be protected, their health and safety, but so does nature, so does their environment. And so we're working on kind of a two-pronged strategy, which is we put it in the heading of community rights, and community rights includes the rights of nature. In other words, we're looking at people and nature as being part of a unitary community, not as separate entities, separate things. And that's quite different from the way current Western law treats people, communities, and nature. And so it's it really is maybe a bit, I don't know, I suppose a little overwhelming, the amount of change that's necessary. It requires a paradigm shift to arrive at the strategy and the thinking that we're proposing. But if we're going to really effectuate um, changes that will end the crises that we face, the environmental crisis we face, it's going to take that kind of change in our worldview and our thinking.
Well, we had a chance to speak yesterday, and you articulated that paradigm shift very well in terms of one of the things the democracy school did was to back up and say, how did we get here in terms of this legal environment that we're in, and who did what, where, when. So what you articulated was that we really are still almost in this type of settler colonialism, European superiority complex, aggregation of wealth, extraction of resources type of mentality, versus the indigenous people who have their lands taken over, who feel unity and oneness with nature. Could you go into that a little bit?
Sure. And the democracy school, there's a curriculum that we've put together and we update it regularly. But it's about trying to expose to the participants the history that we're not taught. And in order to understand how we arrived in the situation that we're in now. And part of the problem is rooted in that settler colonial, those settler colonial empires from Europe that over the past 500, 600 years spread out across the globe and conquered and committed essentially genocide and ecocide around the world in order to claim ownership over and control over large land masses and their resources. They call them resources, they're part of nature. This is all rooted in a particular worldview that sees human beings and nature as separate. So human beings are apart from nature, not part of nature and the ecosystem. And as you mentioned, of course, that's not the view that indigenous people around the world take. They see themselves as integrated into the natural system. So studying for descendants of those empires, those European empires particularly, it's important for us to decolonize not just the land, but our own minds. Our minds are still trapped in some of those essential ideas that justify the conquest, the doctrine of discovery that says, well, if we arrive in a new land, even if it's peopled, if they are not as advanced technologically, if they don't believe in the same gods, if they don't have the same philosophies, then we have a right to simply claim that place as our own and to shove them aside, essentially, to say that they don't have rights here. Well, that's not something that folks here would want to embrace as a worldview, and yet uh, there's the dominant culture in this society that takes advantage of the traditions of that really dark past, and uncovering that, exposing it to ourselves, is really what it means. It's important um, that we challenge ourselves and our own thinking on these things. And really, the work that we're doing, the organizing that we're doing, is partly about a new approach to educating the communities we work in. We use the democracy school as one method, and that's very formal. The other is to actually engage in local lawmaking of a sort that when we get involved in it, we're still talking about the same concepts. We're decolonizing the community and their thinking in order to arrive at a better relationship between the people in the community, so it becomes an actual community, and also the relationship between the people and their land base and their ecosystem. So it involves a lot of things. It involves social justice, environmental justice, and justice to the environment itself.
Okay. Well, one of the things I brought up with you when I took the democracy school, I was just struck about how, in some ways, it was similar to this work by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse called Captured, how corporations captured our democracy. And each individual chapter is how corporations captured our elected officials, our regulatory agencies, the courts, and even the jury system. Um, so I recommend everyone to that book. But what I feel with CELDF is they create a leverage point in order to counteract, combat, fight this juggernaut of this corporate assault. So could you just kind of walk us through one of the cases, examples that you have worked with, and the phases and the processes, if that comes to mind?
Well, we've worked with quite a few communities, hundreds of them actually, and many of them have enacted local laws that recognize the rights of the community to self-determination and the rights of their local environment and so forth. So, just to mention one to begin with, Grant Township is in Indiana County, Pennsylvania. Grant Township is a very small municipality, and they are rural, and they depend on groundwater, well water, for their drinking, for all their source of the water they need to survive. Um, Now, fracking became quite a large issue, a real concern, beginning about 10, 11 years ago, maybe a few more, in Pennsylvania. That's where I am right now. Grant Township was targeted by PGE Corporation. Uh, they wanted to site a injection well in Grant Township. And what I mean by an injection well It's a place where the waste, the blowback, the flowback fluids that come out of the ground in the process of extracting gas, methane and ethane and so forth, from deep fissures in the ground. They wanted to take that waste material and pump it into the ground in Grant Township, an injection well for frack waste. Now, frack waste includes radioactive material that is forced up from those depths, that they're safe underground where they are naturally. But once you bring them up and expose them to the air, to the environment, and to the waterways and so forth, it's very toxic. And so are the chemicals that are used, that are pumped into the ground to cause fissures in the rock below and to free the gas so that it'll come up and it can be collected. Their proposal was to pump this stuff in the ground. Of course, the folks in Grand Township thought it would be a really bad idea to pump that stuff into the same ground where they extract their drinking water. And they've been fighting it, well, now for going on 7 years. The first thing they did was enact a local law that we helped draft for them that banned the siting of such a waste injection well, that recognized the rights of the community to do so, to protect their health and safety, and that recognized the rights of ecosystems within the community, those ecosystems having legal rights of their own that the people in the community had legal standing to represent in court. I can't go into all the details in a short amount of time.
Well,
just go ahead. Yeah, sure.
Well, to share those details, I have right here the trailer for Invisible Hand.
Oh yes, there's a film. It's a major film, and it's received quite a few awards. And it tracks the story of Grant Township, as well as it covers the Dakota Access Pipeline and a couple of other things. But the focus is rights of nature and how communities are advocating for this. But I think you have the trailer there.
Let me.
I shall share with you a prophecy that was left to us by the peacemaker as he was leaving the Bay of Quinte.
Indigenous people, we are the conscience of this land. We're trying to wake people up.
What you're seeing is really, I think, in the beginnings of an international movement.
En el campo del reconocimiento de la naturaleza como sujeto de derecho es revolucionario.
It's not an environmental movement unless it protects nature as a rights-bearing entity.
What do you say to your critics that say, this is absolutely batshit crazy?
Absurd. Can I go now?
We recognize a right that this watershed has had that's long been ignored. Its right to thrive, to flourish.
The out-of-state extremists pushing the Lake Erie Bill of Rights don't care about Toledo.
Tonight, residents are under order not to drink, wash dishes, brush their teeth, or give tap water to their pets, and not to boil it for use.
It is we as man who have strayed from our original instructions.
This is the beginning of a legal system in favor of nature.
Were you aware of the risks and the potential that you were going to be sued and all of that at the time?
We were aware ahead of time that we were indeed going to get sued, but we just went ahead with it.
Either you stand up or you don't.
We don't have an injection well problem, we have a democracy problem.
We have shifted our government to one that's now become totally corporate control.
Capitalism.
It was a magic of the price system.
Hasn't it given us the highest standard of living in the world?
Don't be guilty of that corporate thinking.
If you lived in this area, would you want the injection well in your area?
Okay, next question.
The laws that are in place and the regulations that are in place right now are not working.
We can't rely on our legislatures to protect us.
So you have the corporation, the federal judge, and the State Department of Environmental Protection all crashing down on this community and attempting to get them to submit to the injection well.
I can't support an organization that doesn't believe in true environmental protection. And
if a corporation has the same constitutional rights as an individual, why couldn't an ecosystem?
Don't lose the faith, don't lose the focus. You just have to keep doing it.
It's about the water. It's always been about the water.
Okay, we're back, everyone. So, Ben, would you, does that prompt you to develop a little bit further this Rights of Nature initiative?
Sure. Yeah, part of what you saw in the film clip there, and it's just the trailer, but they were talking about the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. And that's one of the measures that our organization worked with the people in Toledo, Ohio, where they circulated petitions to put the rights of the Lake Erie Bill of Rights on the ballot. And they did so successfully after a lot of opposition and attempts to keep it off the ballot. And when it was voted on by 67% of the voters, became law. And then it was challenged by one corporation, and the court said,
Sorry.
Sorry? And so the Lake Erie Bill of Rights is one of the examples of the work that we do in communities. I was really honored to work in 2006 in Tamaqua, Pennsylvania, with the very first community on the planet to recognize rights of nature. It was a significant change and a significant new approach through law to protect the environment in ways that did not allow it to be minimally protected through regulation. And so that's the approach we take. I just want to say the rights of nature is a really important and central to the work that we do. And it is interesting that back when we first proposed it, back in 2006, when I first worked on the first community to enact such a law, it was unheard of. And people scratched their heads and said, why would you do that? I mean, are you telling me that trees and chipmunks are going to be able to sue us? And just to be clear, the rights of nature is about collective rights. It's about the rights of ecosystems. So the matrix of living species in an ecosystem have a right to interact, to work together, to evolve, and to flourish. That's the principle behind rights of nature. It's not exactly the same thing as animal rights, which of course I think that yes, animals should also have individual rights, but it's not a statement that people shouldn't be able to eat meat or things like that. It's that ecosystems can't be sacrificed to the profit motive so that they can't recover, so that they can't flourish, and so that they require human management to even exist. Nature is the context in which human life occurs. It's not ancillary, although our laws treat nature as though it has no other legal status than that of property, which is a real problem in our culture. The highest law in the United States protects the rights that are vested in property, associated with property. And that goes back to the founding of the country. When initially the Constitution was ratified, it recognized so-called property rights in slave owners that said that their right to own that other human being was sacrosanct, and that human being who was considered under the law to be property had no rights of its own. Well, we have the 13th Amendment that didn't exactly get rid of slavery altogether. We're still, there's an exception for people who have been incarcerated. It's still legal to enslave them, according to the US Constitution. And debt is still a method for controlling and owning the labor of people. And so we haven't perfected that yet. But certainly we haven't even begun to protect nature as a rights-bearing entity, as more than just property in the eyes of the law. And yet corporations, which I should say corporate property, it's simply wealth held in common by a group of people, investors and so forth. And that property has been recognized to have the same Bill of Rights protections as human beings by the US Supreme Court. And so we have a real problem where we have to, if we're really going to address the problems of environmental destruction, of ecocide, we're going to have to change the legal perception of nature and to recognize it as, in and of itself, a rights-bearing entity. I see there is a question, is, have I written a book? And yes, you did manage in your introduction to mention that. And I'll just mention it again because it bears on this idea about property, that rights can be vested in property. So the rights of the slaveholder were constitutionalized, but also there were certain rights that were attached to the slaves. They didn't get to enjoy them, but they were counted as 2/3 of a person when it came to representation in Congress for Southern states. In other words, it skewed their representation, the power, how many representatives they had in Congress at the House of Representatives, in favor of those states that allowed the ownership of human beings. In a similar way, corporations are recognized to have constitutional protections. And it's like the new 2/3 law, 2/3 clause in the Constitution that said that slaves would be counted as 2/3 of a person. Corporations are counted as persons. And what that creates is extra governing advantages, extra power in the hands of those who own and control corporations above and beyond the equal rights and equal representation of real human beings in the United States. And I talk about these issues in my book, How Wealth Rules the World. So you can get a bigger, more complete story of this issue of property and how it's attached rights that then are conveyed to the owners of that property, and that creates new privileges and governing power for the owners of wealth. Explains a lot about why regular folks in this country don't actually run it.
Okay. So you, along the lines of the new paradigm, you mentioned something, a favorite book of yours called The Next Revolution. And can you explain and describe why that's your favorite book?
Well, I don't know if it's my favorite book, but it's one that I recommend people take a look at. It's by Mary Bookchin. I'll hold up a copy if you want. I happen to have it on the desk here. But Mary Bookchin, it's called The Next Generation, or Next Revolution, Popular Assemblies and the Promise of Direct Democracy. And it has a foreword by one of my favorite authors, Ursula Le Guin. But Mary Bookchin's been writing about community rights, without calling it that, for quite a long time. And it's about how can the people living in a community become the captains of their own fate. In other words, how can they gain self-governance? We have this story, we tell ourselves, a tradition in the United States that we're a self-governing people. And And sometimes that just means we get to vote every 4 years for president, and we get to vote for governor of the state and other officials. But voting, of course, voting rights are being limited left and right these days. But voting isn't self-governance. Choosing your leaders isn't the same thing as leading your own community collectively. And not enough to say that we're self-governing when the people in a community actually aren't the ones who are making the governing decisions that affect their lives immediately. I like to define democracy as a form of government in which the people who are affected by governing decisions are the ones who make them. And in our democracy schools, I often ask, in your community, are people who are affected by governing decisions the same ones who make them? Show your hands if you think that the people in your community are the ones who decide things about how it's going to work out for your lives and your families. And I don't see hands being raised. And what that means is people don't see themselves as being in charge of their own fate, of being able to make governing decisions for their own community. And I don't mean individually, but collectively. There's a problem with that. It means that that the many municipalities in the United States, just to give an example, in Pennsylvania, there are over 2,000 municipalities in the state. That's not the case in every state. They're organized differently. But in Pennsylvania, every county is subdivided into townships and boroughs, maybe up to 20, 25 different municipalities in every county. And in none of these municipalities in Pennsylvania or in any of the other states is there a recognition of a right of local community self-government. That's not recognized in the federal Constitution. And in fact, it's been intentionally limited by legal doctrines like Dillon's Rule. Some folks may be familiar with that. We do talk about it in our educational series, but Dillon's Rule is a legal theory that was developed after the Civil War by an Iowa State Supreme Court justice. And he said that municipalities have the same relationship to the state in which they exist as a child has to a parent. In other words, the municipality has no legal agency of its own, can't make decisions on its own without asking mom and dad. In other words, the state legislature and the state courts have to get permission before they can make deliberative decisions about what would be appropriate in their community. And if you think about it, it means that in our municipalities, when you go to your local township or town or city meeting and you ask your elected officials to say no to a proposed industrial project that the community generally perceived will be harmful to their environment, to their health, to their water, whatever it is. And those elected officials so frequently turn to the folks in the meeting and say, we sure wish we could help, but our hands are tied. The state preempts us, in other words, forbids us from regulating those corporations. The state says, no, it's none of your business. It's above your pay grade. The state legislature will regulate those industries, those corporations, and you're forbidden from doing so. Well, there's a problem when we can't govern the entities, the corporations that propose to come into the jurisdiction of our municipalities, our communities, and engage in activities that might inflict harm. That is a problem. And the question is, well, what can we do about it? That's part of the work that the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund has been involved in since its inception. Well, frankly, since about 5 years after its inception, because we started out really working in the regulatory system in very traditional ways, the way that most environmental organizations do. And we discovered finally that challenging permits, you could succeed in challenging permits and have them overturned, their issuance, only to see the corporate applicants come back reapply, having made some amendments to their application, and then being issued the permits, because permits are issued as a matter of right. We don't have discretion at the local level. We didn't make the regulations, and we don't issue the permits in general. It's the state that does, that makes those rules. And generally, the state accommodates profit-making corporations over the interests and concerns of local communities. And again, that's a problem. What you heard in the clip for Invisible Hand, one of our community folks in Grand Township said, you know, we don't just have a water problem, we have a democracy problem. If we didn't have a democracy problem, if we were allowed to make democratic decisions about what corporations do in our backyard, we wouldn't have this water problem. But we're being denied that power, that authority, and that right, the right of local self-government, community rights.
So can you go into a little bit more details about CELDF, where you're all located, where do you get your funds? And for people, our listeners, then how do they access this thought leadership and resources and services? It's like maybe like giving a tour around your website, but because I understand that the democracy school has now been shortened to 6 hours. So how can people access that?
Well, the democracy school's been during the COVID-19 pandemic, since we haven't been meeting in person, we have been doing an online version. And so it's 2 hours for 2.5 hours actually for 3 consecutive, or not necessarily consecutive days, but 3 different days. We found that 2 hours is about the max that people want to sit on a Zoom call. And so that's what we've done. But so CELDF our office is based in Mercersburg, Pennsylvania. But you can't visit there and get the tour because it's just where our office is. I'm about 2.5, 3 hours north of Mercersburg in Pennsylvania. I'm in Carbon County, Pennsylvania. We have organizers around the country. For instance, Michelle Sanborn's in New Hampshire. We've got Chad Nicholson is our Pennsylvania organizer. He is in the Pittsburgh area. Tish Odell's in Ohio. She works with communities in Ohio and elsewhere. We've got organizers, Kai Hushka is in Oregon. We've got folks in Colorado and in Virginia. So we're kind of, we don't get around the water cooler and chat every day. I wish we could, but that we are a kind of far scattered group, and we work in communities around the country. So that I'm working with, as you mentioned, Laurie, folks in Asheville, North Carolina. I'm working with folks in Virginia. I've worked with folks in Colorado, in California, all over the place. I think there was a question about our funding and so forth. We're a nonprofit organization, and we apply for grants and we ask for donations. So about half of our funds come from individual donations, and about half of them come from grants and foundations that we apply for. And, you know, so we have to seek out those sources of funding that are interested in the kind of work we do. And that's empowering communities, protecting the environment. And just to be really clear, we're also working on social justice issues as well. I worked in Denver on, they call it the Right to Survive Charter Amendment. And it is a rights of people without homes that are being treated rather poorly by official dictate from the city, where the police simply force people without homes to move on and not rest, not have places to have a right to be. That's a real issue. We've developed a really cutting edge ordinance with lots of moving parts. That is about putting an end to police violence against victimized communities, people of color, impoverished communities, and the rest. People have rights. It doesn't matter what their ethnicity is. It doesn't matter what their bank account looks like. We all should, and by right, we should all be treated with the same respect. And that's not the case in this country.
So, so Ben, so over this illustrious career, just what are some of the listing some of the types of corporate raider assaults that you and your colleagues have been involved with?
That's a big topic. What kinds of corporate assaults on communities? And it's been on communities. It's also been on our form of government and on our right to use government as a democratic tool. And so, honestly, back when I first started, I was CELDF's first community organizer, and I started working mostly with rural communities in Pennsylvania. So it was folks who were fighting corporate farming. It was putting independent farms out of business, just wiping them out. They couldn't compete. And as well, the pollution, the toxins that come from that concentration of animals in small areas, and the waste that comes from them being spilled into the waterways and so forth, was causing real health and environmental issues. So we began there, and also with communities that were opposing the distribution of waste, essentially urban sludge collected from waste treatment plants in the cities. Of course, the idea was these plants were set up so that they could remove the horrible stuff from the water and then return the water to the waterways so that it wouldn't pollute. They're still left with the toxins and the rest that they take out of the water, and they have to do something with it. So along with landfilling it, they were also heating it up, claiming that they were killing pathogens, and then taking it out to the rural areas and offering it to farmers as free fertilizer, which of course they were enticed. Free fertilizer, well, that's a savings. What they weren't told when the EPA issued their permits and said, yes, this is great, nutritious stuff for your crops, they didn't mention that it included PCBs and pharmaceuticals and low-level radioactive waste from hospitals, and every kind of solvent that's ever flushed down a drain from a factory or an auto repair shop. All of these things are in the soil and never removed when it's brought to the farmers to be used as fertilizer. So communities were opposed to that idea. That was where we began. Since then, it's been any number of corporate assaults. When I say assaults, it means not just the fact that the corporations would enter and say want to extract, not just necessarily getting rid of waste, but also extract. For instance, there's concern right now in Virginia with a proposed gold mine that would be a huge blight on the environment. In Southern Virginia, about I guess it was probably about 12 years ago, there was a proposal to open up uranium mining in Southern Virginia, which would have been a real problem. I worked with the city of Halifax, Virginia, and they enacted a community bill of rights there that would hold liable any entity, including corporations, that were responsible for poisoning the community with radioactive materials, and not just the community of people, but the community, including the ecosystems. Nature has a right not to be poisoned as well. We're working on lots of issues, but also it's a systemic thing. It's not about the site fights. It's not just about the particular corporate activity that is onerous to the community. It's a systemic problem where the corporations fund the campaigns of our state and federal legislators, where they write bills and submit them to those legislators and have them turned into laws. And those laws frequently are about preempting or forbidding the people from protecting themselves against the harmful activities of those corporations and those industries. And so we have, for instance, now a federal civil rights lawsuit filed in Ohio representing a number of counties in the state, counties that we drafted home rule charters for them. They were not home rule counties, and they wanted to create local constitutions. That's what a home rule charter is, that would have recognized the authority of the people to protect themselves against these activities, would have recognized their authority to establish local community self-government and rights of nature. And each and every one of those proposed charters was withheld from the ballot. Voters were refused the right to vote on them, to even see them, because of the machinations and the essentially conspiracies of the corporate folks in conjunction with legislators who snuck information or snuck preemptions into their budget bill, in the dead of night, sneak it into a budget bill that has to be passed to fund the government. And so it becomes law. This is a dishonest way for people to engage in government. And it is also a dishonest way for wealthy people to deprive the majority of Americans of the right to engage in the democratic process. That is a corporate assault on our communities as well.
So Invisible Hand is your second documentary. The first one was called We the People 2.0. And I do recommend that just for the graphics of listing these corporate raiders. And then it had maps of the United States of where these assaults and raiders, were conducting their actions. So that was very educational. We the People 2.0.
Yeah, that's it's a bit older film, and it's interesting that we've had filmmakers who've been fascinated by the work we do, and so has print media. Rolling Stone has done a number of feature articles about our work, for instance, in Grant Township. It's I have to say that it's exciting work. I really enjoy the work that I do, but my inspiration really comes from the people that I work with, the communities. When we're called in and we're asked to help, and I see some questions in the chat about do we work with different groups and organizations? We've been kind of a lone wolf in these efforts for quite a while because, well, frankly, people have, and traditional environmentalists, for instance, early on, we're a little concerned that maybe this is a little bit too radical. We're working outside the box and the comfort zone of traditional environmental work. But I see in more recent years, more and more people becoming kind of enamored of the strategy and moving towards it, especially things like the rights of nature. It's an idea whose time has come. In 2006, Tamaqua, we worked with them and they passed the first rights of nature law. 2 years later, Ecuador, the people in Ecuador, by popular vote, enacted a constitution for the nation that recognizes the rights of Pachamama, Mother Earth. And since then, we've got rivers in India. We've got national laws in Bolivia. We have, I won't go through the litany of all the nations that have begun to explore and to adopt laws recognizing rights of nature. There's going to be a lot of films, I would say, and We the People 2.0 is a pretty good film, and it covers a lot of the work we do. It's worth watching. I think that the invisible hand is just a little bit more recent, and it covers, a little bit more up to date. One of the things I noticed over the years, my years of working in this, is that although folks started out being skeptical, even the most progressive minded folks were skeptical about the challenging way that we confront the system, because we see the problem not as site fight here, site fight there. It's really a systemic problem that prevents communities from being able to protect themselves and their ecosystems, because the interests of profit-making corporations are held in higher esteem by the law than the rights of people in this nation these days. And I shouldn't say these days, it's been quite a long time, probably from the beginning. And so we've been originally, I think, looked at askant as, well, this is a bit much, isn't it? I think that over the 17 years I've been at it, attitudes are changing. And it's a lesson in how movements build and become the agents of social change. And I think we're on the cusp of making some major changes, and they're necessary. We're facing climate crisis. We're facing ecosystem collapse, and as they refer to it as the sixth major extinction. These are problems that we have to confront in a real way, and we can't hold on to the old ways. We have to get out of our comfort zones and make some big changes. And I see that beginning to happen.
So tell people how to reach CELDF, how to find out more about CELDF, your website.
It's CELDF.org. And if you send an email to info@CELDF.org, it will go to our office, and depending on where you're located and what your issue is, it will be sent out to the appropriate organizer or personnel to respond to you. Or you can get a hold of me directly, and that's at Ben Price, no space, Ben Price @CELDF.org.
Well, Ben, this has just been so inspirational. And I just have to say, in that meeting with the democracy school, it wasn't just hope, it was inspiration. It was like, this is leverage, this is cutting edge, this is breakthrough. So it's just such an honor to know about your work. And just a little plug for the Asheville initiative here in Asheville. Community Roots mounted an initiative petition for a community bill of rights. And the assault for us was Duke Energy monopoly. So you get that corporate capture from that book from Sheldon Whitehouse. Why do we have a monopoly? Why can't we get any energy that's renewable, or any plan towards climate justice?
And why can't the community control it instead of a big corporation?
Yeah. So Ben, any quick last 2 minutes on your help with the Asheville?
It's something that we see all the time, but the city attorney has already advised that they might essentially attempt to prevent the initiative from appearing on the ballot. If they try to do so, I've advised that they should look into a mandamus lawsuit, because the city and the Board of Elections have no authority other than what's called ministerial authority. They have a job to do, and that's to see if they have enough signatures, if the petitions are correct, and if that's the case, then they have a ministerial duty. It's their job to put it on the ballot, and it's not their job to act as though they were a court of law and decide ahead of time whether it should go on the ballot, whether it's legal or constitutional or any of that. And what we're hearing is they're considering taking on that role. to deputize themselves as junior judges. Well, if they do that, I think there might be a lawsuit involved. But kind of obstacles you run into, not to worry. A movement's going to run into obstacles, and to make the change we have. They say, our folks in Ohio say, you don't quit, or you don't lose till you quit. So don't quit.
And that was the example in Grant Township, if you see Invisible Hand, that they went through the ringer for years and only at the end to have a court acknowledge their home rule and to ban the injection well. But it took 6 years.
We're still in the battle.
Okay.
We're still in the battle, and the Department of Environmental Protection in Pennsylvania sued Grant Township for protecting their environment too well.
Okay.
That's the kind of ironic things that come out of this. But see the film.
Okay, Ben. Well, thank you for joining us and for your time and your wisdom, perseverance, dedication. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. It's been a real drink from a fire hose, and we love all that you're doing. And thank you, Laurie, for bringing Ben. I've shared it many, many places, and I hope other people do that as well. Listen and share. It's good. It's good stuff for community, for humankind.